Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one we see that the Russians have made further advancements within the Avdiivka direction. They have managed to capture the military base here to the southwest of Avdiivka. Zooming in, we see that there are multiple trenches going through the base, and the area itself was used for a large concentration of Ukrainian troops, as well as air defense systems for the southwest of Avdiivka, preventing the Russians from getting their air force close to Avdiivka. It is reported that the Ukrainians withdrew from it with a few left behind to hold up the base, and the Russians captured those, so they ended up capturing the base without a fight. And as such, we see that the Russians now have control over this military base, which consolidates their gains here in the north, where they've yet again managed to advance a bit further, capturing the rest of the streets. So with this, we see that the Russians now only have one threat here to the west of their current gains, and that is this area right here, the Dacia area to the southwest of Avdiivka. Again, there are some trenches in the area and fortifications all throughout the area. This means that the Russians would have a hard time storming it. From the south, we see that in the southern direction there are multiple trenches a bit further away as well, and it is connected with the first lines. There are some tracks that shows military vehicle movement. There are trenches within the Dacia area itself, as well as here to the northwest of it. But in the northeastern direction, there really isn't anything, which means that the Russians can move from Avdiivka itself towards this Dacia area and flanking it from the side. If they combine this with a storming in straight ahead from the forest lines, we may see the Russians attacking this position and trying to push the Ukrainians out, or we may see a voluntary Ukrainian withdrawal to the Citadel area. The Citadel area has been described by Russian soldiers as a very strong stronghold. It's a very tough position. The Ukrainians have very firm control over it. It has multiple high-rise buildings. This is a very difficult area to fight in. For the attacker, the defender has a significant advantage until the attacker gets a foothold. Then it evens out a lot. Especially if one side has more firepower than the other, they will get the advantage. But generally, when you're attacking in urban areas, it's very, very difficult, especially to get a foothold when the high-rise buildings are out towards a field. So likely we'll see the Russians continue advancing in a northern direction rather than towards it from the south. We may see a Russian movement towards the forest lines depending on how the terrain and territory is right now. It's difficult to say as I do not have any video evidence to point at, but we do see that there are some fortifications and trenches here in the area. However, this is again towards the fields. We see that there are multiple trenches here to the south of the forest lines. This means that the Ukrainians were planning to deal with a Russian advance from the south, one that they had to face in the fields. But instead, the Russians, after pushing through the Ukrainian fortifications here to the southeast of Avdiivka, have pretty much bypassed all of those fortifications and trenches here to the west. So we see that the Russians now, with this gains here in the southeast of Avdiivka, they have gained a significant advantage and have significantly sped up the process of sieging down Avdiivka. Especially with the capture of the military base, the Russians may see more activity with their air force here in this direction. If that happens, then the Citadel area will be in very difficult position, as it would have to get more bombardments by the Russian FAB 500s and the FAB 1500. And at the same time, if the Russians manage to gain more helicopters closer to the front line, they could also provide close air support, since the military base here at the very outskirts of the front line has been taken down by the Russians. So with this, we see that the front line positions of the Ukrainian anti-air defense systems would likely be here in central Avdiivka, and as such, there are multiple kilometers behind what they were before, and this could make a significant difference, but I'm not sure as I do not have enough information. As for the eastern parts of Avdiivka, the Dacia areas here would be in a very difficult situation, as the Russians have gotten very close to the supply lines that goes here to the east, and with their advancements in the south, the Ukrainians would have to focus on that, and likely the Ukrainians would concentrate their forces within the center of Avdiivka rather than their outskirts, especially with the threat to the city itself. So the reason why the situation deteriorated to this point for the Ukrainians is based on three main reasons. The first one is the lack of manpower to this part of the front. With the arrival of the 47th Mechanized Brigade after they gave up on the Zaporizhia offensive, the Ukrainians were able to stabilize the front and even counterattack at some points. But since then, the Russians have received more reinforcements, and that is the second point, which is the end of the Russian rotation, which has allowed them to concentrate large enough forces to heavily pressure the Ukrainian positions. And then finally, the lack of supplies for Avdiivka. They've been in this strangled position for a long time now. With months of fighting, the Russians have cut off the northern supply route and the southern supply route, leaving only the central parts, which is significantly less efficient and definitely not sufficient for the amount of forces needed to defend Avdiivka. And as such, the Ukrainians are lacking manpower and supplies, and the Russians finish their rotation, allowing them to have a considerable upper hand with both manpower and supplies. They slowed down earlier prior to this month when the holidays season was active, and since the end of it, they restarted their operations, and since then they have made considerable progress here in the Avdiivka front. Talking about lack of supplies and manpower, there is this article by the Wall Street Journal where this article explains the consequences of a lack of aid from Western countries. Ukraine is facing a $30 billion deficit, which is significant for the budget of Ukraine, especially when they are spending as much as they are on the military. This makes it very difficult for Ukraine to continue as a country with all of the budgets that they have to delay. For example, it says here Kiev could delay salaries, return to printing money if funding from US and EU falls through. As such, printing money and delaying salaries is obviously terrible options, but there's no other options if the US and the EU does not provide. They are planning the budget based on the fact that Ukraine would receive from the US and the EU. If they do not, then it all falls through and they have to resort to these terrible options. And talking about these options, there is this article by Politico where the Slovakian Prime Minister says Ukraine must give up territory to end Russian invasion. He's one of the ones preventing the EU budget from going through. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban prevents the EU aid from going to Ukraine. In return or retaliation for that, the rest of the EU countries said they would want to vote to remove the voting right of Hungary. So, thus, the Slovakian president said, no, that will not happen because the EU needs unanimous, besides Hungary, to agree on that. But if Slovakia disagrees, they can veto it, and therefore both Slovakia and Hungary will keep their veto right, and at the same time the EU aid to Ukraine will not go through. So concluding that if the US and the EU does not provide the aid Ukraine needs, they are in a huge economic crisis, and there's no easy solution. All of the temporary solutions or the quick fixes are terrible options that will have a significant impact on Ukraine itself. And I pretty much predicted all of this at the end of the Ukrainian offensive. This is why I said that the Ukrainians needed to already back in August sit down at the table and negotiate, because the situation would just deteriorate from there. And since then, it has done nothing but deteriorate. And as such, we see that the Russians are now having the initiative. They're pushing the Ukraine across the front, mainly at Avdiivka. The Ukrainians have a significant firepower left. They can still continue fighting. However, in the end, what we see is that the graph for, if we have an X and Y axis where X is the percentage of land owned by Ukraine contra Russia and Y is time, then we had that it was at the very far top. It went down a ton at the start of the invasion. Since then, it was a very slow go way down. But then with the Ukrainians recaptured the Kiev area, then we saw the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives. And then suddenly it has been a big up and down, up and down, up and down. But eventually it will just continue going down. But then again, the future is unpredictable. War is unpredictable. Anything can happen. And they are pretty much betting on a miracle. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.